Today I'm joined by Christopher Ruocchio, author of the fantastic Sun Eater series. I'm going to be sharing 5 lessons that I learned from reading this series, and Chris will be sharing 5 lessons he learned from writing the series. Chris, welcome to the channel.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
This conversation will be spoiler-free until about the 43-minute mark, and I'll put up a warning once we get into spoilers. And I just want to say up front, I learned so much about the craft of writing from this conversation with Chris. So as we go through this, expect to learn why your villain should be more virtuous than your hero, how to write great soft magic, and why Chris thinks most modern writers approach magic the wrong way, the key to developing an immersive, expansive world, why Chris swears by outlining, how to write a complex protagonist, and so much more. So I hope you enjoyed this in-depth writing masterclass with the author of my favorite sci-fi series. So Chris, could you just give people a brief overview of what the Sun Eater series is all about?
Yeah, The Sun Eater is a 7-book, say, space opera, science fantasy adventure. It's set 20,000 years in our future in a time when mankind has conquered approximately a third of the galaxy. But it's a story of a man called Hadrian who is a nobleman. He runs away from home, and he gets caught in the middle of a war between man's empire and the first aliens who've ever really posed a threat to it. He tells you on page 1 that he's the man who ended that war and dealt with the aliens. They're called the Cielsen. And his story is why and how, and about all the things that didn't make it into the official history books. The last book, Shadows Upon Time, will be out this year on November 18th. And I actually just finished it yesterday as of recording. It is June 3rd, so I finished it on the 2nd. I've still got some copy editing ahead of me, but it is done. The finish line is effectively crossed, and still haven't quite processed it. So, happy to be here and to do some of that processing.
Awesome. Yeah, so, I discovered the Sun Eater series about a year ago now. I started reading it when I was walking along this big hike in Spain, the Camino de Santiago, and It has genuinely become one of my favorite series. I think that you have achieved some really just crazy things. I think you're doing some stuff in this series that would probably lead to failure in 9 out of 10 writers' hands, but you are able to be that 1 out of 10 writer that pulls off these crazy twists or makes these really interesting structural decisions. And so really excited to talk about some of the sort of technical sides of how you achieved various things in this series, and also talking a little bit about like kind of the mindset that's been required to write such a long series. But the first lesson I wanted to kind of bring up, I'll just grab the first book actually, just behind me over here. So the first lesson I wanted to bring up was the importance of having an amazing hook at the start of your story. So if you'll indulge me here, I'd love to read to you some of your own writing, the very first 2 paragraphs from Empire of Silence here, because I think that what you're doing with this hook is really, really powerful. I'll get into the specific reason in a bit, but let me just read this opening here. Light. The light of that murdered sun still burns me. I see it through my eyelids, blazing out of history from that bloody day, hinting at fires indescribable. It is like something holy, as if it were the light of God's own heaven that burned the world and billions of lives with it. I carry that light always, seared into the back of my mind. I make no excuses, no denials, no apologies for what I have done. I know what I am. So the reason I bring up that hook there, which I think is just a fantastic example of your prose and such an immersive way to start the story, is that you essentially tell the reader at the beginning of the book that Hadrian is this guy who's wiped out the Cielsen. He has, committed these things that were maybe atrocities or were maybe like the most heroic things that a human has ever done. And then we kind of go back 1,500 years to when he's a kid. And the reason why I think that hook is so powerful is because, there are undeniable moments of slowness in Empire of Silence. And I know you've talked in interviews before about how, you're not necessarily the biggest fan of your first book, although I still think it is great. But I think that the power of that hook is such that even when I encountered moments of a bit of slowness in this book, or I wasn't really sure where things were going, I had so much trust in you from that hook. And I was so curious to see how Hadrian got to this point that I kept reading. So I'd love if you could just talk a bit about how you think about sort of hooking the reader, why you chose that way to start this book, and any other considerations that you had about the opening.
Yeah, so there's sort of like, there are a few threads there, right? The first was just that I am, for my sins, a student of Greek classical literature, right? I backed into a minor in classics accidentally when I was getting my English degree, just because I love this stuff. And my idea initially was that I wanted to start with a single word because it was good enough for Homer, and so it would be good enough for me, surely. And so that sort of gave me the scheme for starting the books with these single words. The ends of the books are also pretty formulaic, right? So there was sort of a structure there. So that was maybe one of the starting places. And another one was with the transition to first person. I'd written third person for almost all of my life. When I started writing as a kid, I knew I wanted to be a writer very young. I hated actually first person for most of my life because I was just like, I actually am not on a spaceship. Like, this is weird. It's uncomfortable. I got over that at some point. And the reason I made the jump to first person was because about midway through college, I realized I was running out of time, air quotes, and that I needed to get something done by the time I graduated. This was the deadline I'd assigned myself. And I needed to make a clean break with everything I'd done before and start over and take things more seriously. And so by shifting to first person, I was making a clean break with the past, but I was also changing fundamentally the nature of the story. And when you make that decision, right, any decision you make in writing suggests a lot of new decisions, right? And you need to sort of run through the flow chart and answer those questions as they arise. And one of the things you get from first person, if you want it, right, because you can do first present, but I find that probably the most alienating form of writing possible outside of second person, is a distance between the narrator and the character, which you can get in third person, but it's a lot more concrete in first. And so I knew I could have a story written by the character after the fact. And I had examples of other stories that I'd liked. Neil Stephenson's Anathem, Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. Although I came to Wolfe actually during the editing process, but that was sort of the one that really crystallized the relationship between the narrator and the character in first person. Because there really are two versions of the main character in any first person text, right? There's the narrator, and then there's the person the story is happening to. And the distance between those two offers you an enormous number of opportunities as a writer. And one of them is that you can do something like this, right? Because if I give you the ending, a piece of the ending, you have something to hold on to, exactly as you're saying, right? That gets you through any of these sort of growing pains, especially that a long series might have, because you have a sense, in the same way that a prologue, right, gets you a sense of where the greater drama might be, even if you have to get through, 5, 6, 7 chapters of the little fantasy village or whatever before you get out into the wider world. Having this sort of hook at the beginning presented to you by the narrator provides this sort of contrast between the narrator and the character that gives the audience a lot of questions, right? You start asking, like, wait a minute, how does this guy become that guy, right? That's a very simple question. But there are lots of little offshoot questions that sort of spiral off about how we get specifically there, or, what are the aliens going to do that changes his attitude, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those questions are really the currency of art, right? Especially of literature, I think, because it's questions that drive engagement, right? If we speak in like very cynical business terms for a moment. If a reader is engaged, right, because they're asking questions, then they are not in a sense bored, even if they don't like a specific section of the book in question. They're a lot more forgiving of any of those qualms because they already have a set of questions they're interested in, right? And the minute you answer questions, there's this great David Lynch quote where he talks about closure with regard to Twin Peaks, right? He says something like, it's a drug, right? The moment you get closure, you have license to forget you've seen the damn thing, right? In this case, read the damn thing. And so having those questions, you need to answer questions, right? But if you can open a ton of them, right, early on, then people will stick around. And that was sort of the primary driving reason for this change. And it was really not intentional at the offset. I did it for that sort of simple, I need to change what I've been working on for my own sanity, right? So that I don't rewrite the same project over and over. Because I had been trying to write something since I was like 8 or 9, right? And I never was conscious of ceasing to write the thing I started writing in second grade and beginning Sun Eater until that break in college, right? And even then, it contains so much of the same DNA. It's still the same organism, but it's mutated. And let's not strain the metaphor too much. And so I didn't know what I was doing initially. And then when I started working on the book, and then when I started editing it, especially because I had this sort of experience with Gene Wolfe providing this prism, this wonderful example of a first-person character, I was able to sort of recrystallize the book in the editing phase and go from there. And the book's already bore several superficial similarities in terms of the texture of the universe and the language used and stuff. It was like man, if I'd read Book of the New Sun, I would never have even tried. I would have done something different. But it provided this opportunity for me to really see what a truly great writer, and I think Gene Wolfe is the greatest science fiction writer of all time, can do with this thing, and with so much focus on this thing, that it sort of clarified what I should be doing, right, and the direction I should be moving. And so that was really the thing.
I think what you said there about suspense is really interesting to me, because you wouldn't necessarily think there's a lot of suspense when the author tells you what the ending is on the first page of a book. But I find myself tremendously curious about where this series is ending up. And I think one of the great things that you do across the series, and I'll sort of talk around this without necessarily getting into deep spoilers here, although, we can get into spoilers later on, and I'll put up a warning for the listeners, is that you kind of tell us at the start of the story, hey, this is the whole ending. This is where it's all going. And then as you progress through the series, you realize, oh, that's actually only like 20% of the ending. We think it's about Hadrian versus this Yeltsin here, but then we discover there is this other entity, these kind of higher stakes that are operating behind this conflict. And it then creates so much more tension within the reader, because they know how it's resolved with this Yeltsin, but they don't know if it's necessarily resolved with this other entity. And of course you have, different characters that come in, different love interests or friends or mentors or these sort of things, who we then, we didn't necessarily hear them mentioned in the beginning of the story. Are they going to be there at the end? Did Hadrian lose them along the way? Or, did they make it, or did they break up, or what's the result of that? So I think that ability to just generate suspense, for me personally, I think that's sort of the fundamental principle behind a great plot is, are you raising questions within the reader that make them really desperate to know what happens next? There's a Frank Herbert quote where he talks about how your only job as a writer is to make the reader want to read the next page. And that's all you should really be focusing on from moment to moment. So yeah, that's a really good lesson. Thank you for sharing your inputs on that. Let's get to your first lesson from writing the series.
So I said before we started recording that my lessons are a little bit less technical. They're maybe a little more broad. When you pitched the idea for the video to me, the one thing that jumped out immediately, which was the hardest, sharpest, clearest lesson I learned very quickly early on, is that outlining is essential. Now there are writers who can get away with not doing it, right? But I find that I'm not one of them, and I found in speaking to a lot of people who are struggling that there's this sort of general sense that the pantser is somehow a purer creature, right? Is a truer writer. I think maybe that's because Stephen King is so iconic, right? For this reason, among others, right? He doesn't plan anything, and yet everyone also says the endings are never that great. I've not, I've read The Shining. That's the extent of my King familiarity, but this is the common meme. And so I sort of puttered around with the first book for years, right? Starting as a kid, and then even in college, it took me probably 3 years to finish Empire of Silence, and at the time it was half as long. It was sort of a completely different book, but that's the book I eventually sold to my publisher. That took me 3 years to write, like 130,000 words originally. And then the funny thing about getting a contract is they then expect the next one very quickly. They're like, hey, can you do this again in like 9 months? And you're like, I have no idea how to do that. And so I needed very quickly to sort of become a professional writer. And that meant developing a toolkit and a method for producing material at speed and at quality. And I was very fortunate in that at the time I was working at Baen Books, science fiction publisher here in North Carolina. They left New York years ago and happened to land in my backyard. And I found a bunch of old David Drake outlines in the office, just for books that were like in the old office folders, because they'd keep files on all the old titles, royalty reports, payment information, but also they'd have a bunch of cool stuff. They'd have like the old transparencies for the cover art, because it used to be that you would do all the typesetting physically, right? You'd have to like stencil cut all the letters and put them on these transparencies, and then you would,
That's awesome.
You would scan those. It's very cool stuff that like nobody even knows about anymore, right? And I found a bunch of Dave's old outlines, and Dave was such a pro. He passed away a couple years ago, but God rest his soul. But they used to time their seasonal schedules at Baen to Dave's releases because Dave was so regular in submitting manuscripts that they just knew they would have a new book from Dave in X months. And it held true until like very close to the end of his life. He was just so, such a pro. I really, really admired Dave. And so I looked at his outlines and they were incredibly thorough. I mean, his books were probably 120,000 words. They were also about the same size every single time. He was just so good at producing a consistent art, right? But his outlines were maybe 40,000 words, so they were like a third the size of the book.
Wow.
And I thought that was a little bit intense, but then I started doing that. And I would outline. I outlined every book since, and I've outlined all my short stories since too. And I found that most of my writer's block, and this is like a very obvious thing to say, was simply the result of my not knowing where I was going, right? It wasn't the language, right?
Yes.
Any of you who experience, writer's block, you then go on Facebook, see someone say something stupid, and then you write 2,000 words in response. You can write fine, right? The writing isn't the problem, it's the planning. And I think that, I'm not saying that you can't write a book, out of nothing, right? You can sit there with a blank Word document and get through it. It is, for most of us, I think, not the most efficient path. And so I advocate very strongly that most writers should come up with some sort of method. I think outlining is great. I now write, I think the outline for Shadows Upon Time was like 50,000 words. So I was pushing Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone length on just the outline. But I've come to think of them as low-resolution drafts because it's a lot easier to get through a chapter when the chapter is this long. The whole pantser-plotter thing is a false dichotomy anyway because plotters have to discover the story when they're outlining, right? This is so much of the language we use as writers, in the community around writing, I think serves to sort of shackle us and to freeze us into these little boxes. You have to be one or the other, right? You have to be a plotter or a pantser. Of course not, right? You don't have to be either of those things. You could just be you. Just write the darn story, right? You need to come up with whatever tools help you. The only methodology that is bad is the one that doesn't get the book finished. And so I simply suggest, when I say that outlining is essential, that it is more likely that you need some kind of plan, right, than it is that you could just sort of do the thing from scratch. And it can look however you need it to look, but you have to do something. And I would never, ever, ever write a book without one at this point.
Chris, it's unbelievable how much you're preaching to the choir here because I went through the exact same experience with the first book I wrote. I was 14, no plan. I just thought that you started on page 1 and you went from there and either you were good enough or not. And it was fun to write, absolutely, but it was just such a mess. And so when I was writing the second book, which is Across the Broken Stars back here, I sat down, I did an outline, and it was insane how much easier it made it for me. It was honestly mind-boggling. I wrote it about 6 times faster. It didn't need as much editing. It was just it was so freeing. And I think that's what the biggest benefit of outlining is for writers. I literally run this sort of boot camp program where I take writers through and help them outline their stories. And it's remarkable because I think you're absolutely right. So often people have this they put pantsing up on this pedestal, right? They're that's the way a true artist does it. That's the way, a true artist should just be able to sit down and create this incredible masterpiece. But if you look at any painting that Da Vinci's done, he's not just starting with the final result. He is doing initial sketches. He's, maybe having a go at it and then, it's not really the way I want it to be. There is an aspect of preparation in there that actually doesn't make it any less artistic when you have that final result. If anything, I would say it makes it, so much better because you have explored 5 or 6 different versions of what this story could be, and you've picked the one that is the best out of all of those. So yeah, I love outlining. It's huge for my process.
It's huge, and you explored it too in a more efficient way, right? Time is when you are 14 and you're trying to write something, time seems infinite, but it really deeply is not. Right?
Yes.
We will all die at some point, right? This is a sort of career anxiety Brandon Sanderson speaks to frequently, right? He's figured out his whole career up until his 70s, right? And he's still not sure he's going to be able to write all the ideas that he has, right? And I try not to think about it that way too much, right? Because as long as I finish all the things that I have in process, I think that's good enough, right? But time is at a premium. I mean, this last book, we had a little girl born a couple months ago, and I was trying
Congratulations.
desperately to finish the book before she got here, and I failed, and it became substantially harder to finish the book. I mean, I was working, maybe 3-hour days if I was lucky, right? And
Yep.
and that was true of the couple last months of my wife's pregnancy as well. Life will get in the way, and if you're listening, you're not a full-time writer, you have a job, right? In addition, a different job, in addition to writing. I that's no longer my situation, so you have it harder than I do, as far as time management goes. And if the outline saves you time, right, then you should use it, right? Now, even if you like discovery writing, but if you're seriously trying to make a go at writing professionally, time is money, period, right? But if it saves you time, makes your life easier. Because the other thing too, and I don't know that a lot of people talk about this, but revisions are the worst. They are so much worse than writing the book. And if you can save any amount of time on editing by planning in advance, gosh, you should. Why not? I would so much rather just write new stuff all the time than go fix it. Fixing it is just a nightmare.
So how about do you actually kind of structure the outlines as you go through it? Is there a particular sort of format you're using? Has it changed from book to book? Curious to know what that looks like.
Yeah, so it's more or less what you would think. I break everything down by chapter. And before I even get to that, there's sort of a higher level thing where I'll have a bunch of ideas that I know are going into the book, right? And now for me, that's been easy because it's all been one story, over these 7 books. And so I've had this cloud of things I wanted to get into Sun Eater, and I don't know when they're all going to show up. But then I would look at what's ahead of me and I would say, we're probably going to get this far, right? I think ending here would be good, or I think starting here would be good. Because sometimes I'll skip points and I'll go in between the books too. And I'll leave space to go back and do old stories. And then I'll end up with maybe 10 ideas, right? And I'll put them out in what I think are chronological order. And then at this point, I know approximately how long my chapters are, and therefore how many chapters I need to write a book of comparable length to the other ones. And then I'll say, okay, I have 7 chapters to get from A to B, and then from B to C, right? And it's pretty algebraic, pretty straightforward. And then I'll start outlining it, and then as I go, maybe that 7 will turn into 5, right? Maybe it'll turn into 9, right? And that just sort of will break as I'm sort of figuring out how the action works. So I'll go chapter by chapter. I'll build these chapters. And then the outlines are pretty simple. It's the action of a scene is the main point, right? And if there are 2 scenes, 3 scenes, I try not to do more than 3. Sometimes it happens, but I'll do the action of a scene as a central point, and then just little subnotes as they occur to me will spiral down from those scene action paragraphs, right? If that's keeping in mind a character's journey, right, in this sequence. Right. And then that might remind me that I need to make a note for something in chapter 3, or that relates back to chapter 3 or ahead to chapter 27 or whatever. And then so I'll sort of spiral off these little subpoints, right, as they go. And I don't really have a clear rule for what constitutes a first subpoint or a second subpoint. It's just sort of kind of an intuitive organizational thing for me. If I'm going, I'm this doesn't feel as important a note as that one, I'll move it down. Right. And that's kind of a gut feeling thing. And then I will just do that until I get through the book. I might have a note section at the end that just has general sort of things to keep in mind. And I'll have a sort of grand summary at the beginning. That's maybe 2-3 pages for the whole book. Because I'll take those 10 points and then I will sort of narratize that journey through those 10 points into a cover letter, basically. Because often the publisher is going to want to see that anyway. So it helps to have it. So I'll do that as part of the outline process. And then I will then go into the chapters. And so now I'm in an interesting place. The next project, I do not want the books to be this long again. So I need to cut the number of chapters in half and then figure out how to, assuming my chapters are going to remain the same length, and sort of go from there. So we'll see if that works.
I'm smiling because I feel like every author I've talked to that has written a long series always tells me, oh, the next one's going to be shorter, I promise. So
yeah. I know.
Good luck to you.
We'll see. Yeah. We'll see. I think 200,000 words would be very comfy. This last book ended up at 372,000 words, and that's crazy.
Oh man,
I have
that's
a very
huge.
Deep spiritual conviction that books probably shouldn't be that long, and yet I wrote one. So here we are.
How long do you spend outlining compared to writing the first draft?
It's maybe like depending on the length of the book, between a third and like a fifth of time. I spend probably a couple of months on them sometimes. Maybe a month on the short end. If it's a novella, it might be like a week. Because they're usually not because they're shorter, right? But also because they're not as intensely hyperlinked, right? When I was working on the main series, there was a lot more like, keep this in mind for the next book, keep this in mind from the previous book. That isn't true with the side stories, just because they're on the side, right? In addition to their being smaller. So I can put a novella outline together pretty quickly at this point. I've also, I have some practice at it. But if I know what the idea is, it can go very, very quickly. That sort of nebulous phase where I'm kind of puttering around trying to figure out what exactly the story is going to be, that can take a really long time. I had a lot of trouble, I remember, with Demon in White. I did not know, like, the first 2/3 of that book. I had no idea what was going to happen. There was this big dead spot. I knew, like, Hadrian was going to go, meet the Emperor. I'll be as vague as possible. And I knew the end. I knew the battle. And I had no idea the rest of the book, and I had to sort of grow that from nothing. And I remember sitting in like the Barnes and Noble cafe, or like getting breakfast and like writing on Post-it notes, because I like to do that early phase non-digitally, because I just need to get away from the computer, because all of those any distraction on the computer is too much for that. I can turn off the internet when I'm writing, and that's fine. But to sort of get ideas, like if I'm at my desk, it's just it's the same computer I play video games at. Something's going to go wrong,
Yes.
And so I need to walk away, and so I went and I did a lot of scribbling on loose leaf paper at breakfast or something, and it's something I haven't been able to do in a while. I'm hoping I'll be able to get back to that for this new series. But
in terms of the next lesson, I would say that what I really want to talk about is how to create a complex and multifaceted character. I would say that Hadrian Marlowe, the protagonist of your series, is one of my favorite characters like ever created. And
thanks.
I guess one of the things that I think really contributes to that is all the contradictions and the sort of internal conflicts that are raging within him. You have this contradiction between, is he a hero or is he a villain? I mean, it literally says that on one of your books here, right? It's like, hero, villain, you have to find out. I think that's the cover quote or whatever. That sounds kind of simplistic, right? But I think it actually speaks to one of the things that really makes me invested in a narrative is when I have a character who clearly has these sort of internal contradictions that are pulling them apart inside. They're wanting to, become king. They're wanting to gain all this power, but they're also just wanting to have, this quiet life in the countryside, for example. And that sort of internal contradiction is generating a lot of the plot events, the sort of interactions with other characters. And the way I kind of think about it is that the more of these contradictions you build within a character, that's what dimension actually means. Like when people talk about this is a 3-dimensional character or a 5th-dimensional character or whatever, the way that I kind of like to define that is, a character with 5 dimensions is someone with 5 main contradictions that's going through them. So with Hadrian, it might be, this sort of hero-villain dichotomy. It might also be Messiah figure versus fraud, right? Because he has this sort of legendary status that's developing around him. It might be, human versus, I don't know what you want to call the other end of that, like enhanced or something. He is someone who's struggling with his humanity, but he also feels like he's not human at the same time. And just be curious to know, like, do you think about contradictions or complexity in that particular way, or are you developing it in some other method? Because to me, I think that's, there's so many things I love about Hadrian, but I think the contradictions are a big part of that.
I think for him, certainly, I love Hamlet, right? And Hamlet is a very indecisive character, but he's indecisive because he is almost cripplingly aware of consequence, right? There's the scene where he can kill Claudius, doesn't kill Claudius because Claudius is praying, and if he kills him while he's praying, he thinks he will go directly to heaven, and that's really not what he wants to have happen, right? And so he's ticking through all these sort of second and third and fourth order consequences of his actions. And Hadrian does that a lot, right? Now, is he always, right about the consequences? Like, no, right? None of us is. And I think I'm sort of like this, frankly. And this is maybe, this is useful when you're writing because you have to do that because that's what plotting is, actually, right? It's the same process. But in a person who's not trying to make sort of art in a vacuum in the privacy of his own house, right? It can be a lot more dangerous if this person is, say, a political figure that needs to make snap decisions, but he's actually sort of like working through all this stuff. I don't, however, think that contradictions necessarily make a good character. I know a lot of people feel differently about this, but I really adore Aragorn, right? And I adore him because his development is over, actually, right? He is a fully self-actualized, like realized character. The film version, this is not true. He's like questioning whether or not he wants to be king. The book version, absolutely not. He has wanted to be king since he was 20, and he fell in love with Arwen, right? And he knows that if he's going to win her in the eyes of her father, right, and whom he respects and will not go around, behind the back of trying to make this work, he must be no less than the High King of Gondor and Arnor, and that is awesome, actually, right? And then all of his conflicts are external, right? And there is something kind of amazing about that. Now, in a main character, maybe not, right? But in a character generally, that's pretty cool, actually. Virtue is a different kind of attractive in a character, right? This is sort of the Captain America thing, too. The nice thing about Captain America is that everyone around him is bent and he is not, right? And that contrast is also exciting, but it's an extrinsic contradiction. It's not in the character, it's between the character and the world. And that's still very engaging, right? Because if you can sort of, this is what's appealing about Superman too, fundamentally, is that you literally have this guy who cannot break, right? And the world must break around him, right? So the shape of the drama changes. Now that can be hard to write compellingly, right? This is always the criticism of Superman, is that like a lot of his stories aren't interesting. But that's the fault of the writers, right? That's not the fault of the premise. The premise is solid, just make it work. I don't have a Superman plot off the top of my head, but like it can be done. But that wasn't the character in this case. I think a lot about Byron because Byron is great. I like the Romantic poets, and I like Keats the best, but
there's a lot of him in Hadrian for sure.
He's certainly the more interesting person. Byron's a lot more colorful a character, and there was a lot of Byron in Hadrian, and so I wanted to write a character in that mold because I wanted to write a character in that mold, not because of a sort of felt philosophical belief that he needed to be sort of a mercurial, multi sort of perspective character, right, where he's pulling against himself. That is interesting, right? But I don't think it's the only way to make an interesting character.
I just think there's so many aspects to why I enjoy reading about Hadrian. And yeah, I was just curious to know how you achieved it. And I think that you've really pointed out a few good aspects there, right? Like this sense of someone who's sort of crippling aware of the consequences of his own actions. And really it's a story about exploring the consequences of his actions, right? Like the entire story is him trying to make sense of, well, why did I do this thing? What led to this? And was it justified? Did I hurt people along the way? Like, all of these interesting questions. So it's kind of, giving that character such a almost overwhelming sense of self-awareness and of empathy towards other people. Maybe that's a strange word to apply to it, but I think there's that real aspect of like, Hadrian is just so aware of the consequences of his actions. And this is another thing as well, where it helps that you are writing in this journalistic first-person recounting perspective as well, because then you are able to have this aspect of Hadrian, commenting on how his past self wasn't aware of what this would do. But in fact, this one conversation he had with this guy here led to, this guy going off and, doing this crazy thing or whatever. So I think that really adds to it as well. And is a good example of what you said earlier in the chat about how, writing is this decision tree thing where every little choice you make about the structure or the perspective or the tense, it's going to come back later on. And as an author, your job is to know how to sort of incorporate that in rather than feeling like you're being hemmed in or restricted by the choices you've made. It's about knowing how to flourish within the constraints that you have given yourself.
Yeah, and this is a perfect segue, actually, because the next thing I'd written down was that constraints are opportunities, right? And when I said this, I was thinking more about publishing imposing mandates on me, right? Because I would have word count limits imposed and things like that. And I had a book split on me. And sort of when that happens, you have to figure out, how to solve those problems. And when you have a problem to solve, you get to be a lot more creative than you are in a vacuum, right? Absolute freedom is crippling, actually, right? What's useful is like being channeled in a direction. And if you are given it, like this is like, when you're given a prompt, right, for a writing assignment in class, and it's really not the prompt you wanted. You want it to be the thing that you really wanted to write, and you're like, how do I make this thing that they gave me the thing I want to write actually, right? And then you kind of like, the writer as a lawyer, right? You like make this case. The story is this argument that you're making to the professor, right, or whoever, yes. Right? The magazine you're pitching to. That really my story belongs here, darn it. And when you do that, you sometimes have your best ideas, right? Challenge is way better, as a muse than anything else. And but this comes too with any narrative choice you're making, like we're talking about perspective, right? You lose things in a first person. You lose the ability to be in other people's heads mostly, right? There are ways you can cheat that actually, right? Which is also an opportunity, right? But you can't do like a big multi-point of view battle sequence, right? You have to be in one guy's head. But then you get to be in one guy's head. And my favorite war movie of the last several years is 1917, which is absolutely like with one guy the whole time. It pretends it doesn't cut ever, right? And that's very intense. It's also just very beautifully made. Deakins was the cinematographer; he's a genius. But that was like very intimate, and it was a very different story, right? And so the limitations that are imposed on you by your own decisions change the character of the story. And if you are aware of how, right, then you can lean into those things and you can strengthen those elements of the story instead of trying to make it something it's not, which is in a weird way the opposite of that advice I just gave about twisting the prompts your professors give you. But you sort of steer into the choices that you're making, because then you get these other gifts, right? You get the opportunity to instead be with one person very deeply and psychoanalyze them and have them psychoanalyze themselves, have them delude you, delude themselves, delude other characters. And there's a dramatic tension there. And that's like because you made a point of view choice, right? Which is like a very high level, prima facie decision. You might not even know why you're doing it, except you want to try it, right? But then you realize you get all these opportunities. And this is true of everything else. Conversely, if I had written multi-point of view third person, I would not be able to write Hadrian the way that I did, right? He would be in the book. He would be very different. I've often thought, as I'm writing some of the trickier parts of the series, that I made a horrible mistake, and that if I was going to write a first person account, I really should have made it anybody except Hadrian in the story, because it would be so much easier, right, to make him look mysterious and dangerous and powerful if I was outside of his head. Right. And it would be cooler if I saw him from Basander Lynn's point of view. Or you get different benefits from doing that, right? And it's a question of which benefits are most appropriate, but also which benefits are you most interested in, right? Because if you think you can do, and this is kind of getting into my next thing a little bit, but if you think you can do something more effectively, or you're more excited about a certain choice, you should steer the story that way, and then ask yourself from that new vantage point, what are my new limitations, right? And what opportunities do those limitations provide me? Because the best thing that you can do, right, as a writer, is become conscious of all of the reasons that you are making the decisions that you're making. We all start out as unconscious writers, right? But the longer we go on, right, the more deliberate and the more conscious our decisions need to become, right? Just as we're getting better at the job.
You're reminding me here of this great Zelazny quote. I'll just read it out for you here because I wrote it down in sort of preparation for this chat, and I think this is the perfect moment to bring it up. So Zelazny says, "Occasionally there arises a writing situation where you see an alternative to what you were doing, a mad, wild gamble of a way of handling something, which may leave you looking stupid, ridiculous, or brilliant. You just don't know which. You can play it safe there too and proceed along the route you'd mapped out for yourself, or you can trust your personal demon who delivered that crazy idea in the first place. Trust your demon." Shout out to the author Dirk Ashton putting me onto that quote there. But that kind of, I guess, brings me into the next point I wanted to discuss, which is that consistently throughout the series, you make these really bold gambles. And we're going to get into some spoiler territory here. So spoilers here for probably Howling Dark and I would say Kindlings of Death as well, which is books 2 and 4 respectively. in Howling Dark, the second book in your series, there is a scene where Hadrian is beheaded. Now, the story is told from the perspective of Hadrian. And when I read this, I was sat there looking at my page and went, what? This makes no sense. The main character has just been killed. I'm so confused right now. Yeah. And do you want to kind of just tell me, what you were thinking around that decision? And I suppose just going back to that idea of taking the risks and following that demon, as Zelazny says. What moments were there like that for you, where you maybe came up with this crazy idea that deviated from what you originally anticipated, but you followed it through and it really worked out?
Yeah, that's probably the first time that this specifically happened to me, was with that scene. And the reason I did it was because I was looking at, I think, advance reviews, like early reviews on Goodreads for book one. And people were like, this is stupid. Memoirs are bad because I know the main character lives the whole way through. And I said, you dummy, it's science fiction. I can do whatever I want, actually. And so I find that spite has motivated a lot of my artistic decisions. I don't know what that says about me. Actually, I do. But that was sort of where I started. Was this is a ridiculous thing to say? This isn't historical fiction. This isn't normal people books. Science fiction is an infinite field of random possibilities, and I can actually kill the main character. He can get better. It's fine. The question is, like, why? Right? Like, why would I do that? And for what reason? And like, it needed to be a good reason. And so, really, my only sense at the time was how I was going to make this work was by making it as weird as possible. And I've sort of, I guess if my demon here, tells me anything, it's to like keep doing the weird thing. And like, that's sort of just the general heuristic, because the series has gotten, I think, pretty bizarre. I don't know if you're all the way through book 6 or not, but it's gotten pretty out there. And so I always, at this point, if I get a consistent thread of criticism, it's from people who clearly read maybe the first book, maybe half of it, right? They'll say, this is just like Dune. And it is, right? Like, I was, I was a baby. And, I really liked Dune, but I had a lot I wanted to say about Dune, and that I wanted to say about science fiction. And so I wanted to write a book that superficially resembled Dune in a few key ways, and to acknowledge that connection so that I could then argue with Frank Herbert from Beyond the Grave and tell a different story. But then one of the ways I sort of went about that argument is by getting weirder with it. And I got it to book 2, and sort of the first way in which it's manifested was I just don't believe that it's possible for any galactic civilization or any Earth civilization to like completely ban a technology, right? Like, I don't like, clearly the black market exists, right? Clearly, the internet functions for some people in ways that no normal person would want it to function, right? Like, a bunch of horrible things are out there in the world all the time, and the power of the U.S. government, for example, seems insufficient to stop it. So why would the Butlerian Jihad be more effective, right? So there's some world-building decisions there, and this sort of descent into weirdness that is book 2 culminates in this moment where Hadrian is killed, and then gets better, and he doesn't get better through an overtly technological means, right? Which is, in a science fiction series, really, really not the answer people are looking for, right? Or expecting. And for most people, this seems to be pretty surprising in like a good way. Most people seem to like it. There are people who have not enjoyed it, and that's fine. You can't win them all. And maybe that's a lesson. We'll get a bonus one. Like, you really can't win everybody over. Don't even try to write a book for everybody, right? Try to write a book for you and have some faith that who you are is a good enough model of your audience that someone will buy the book, right? Maybe you're wrong. Maybe you are like alone, right, in your artistic desires, but maybe you're not, right? And it is better that you create something true to yourself as the artist, true to your vision of the world, and true to your sense of humor, in a sense, than trying to please everybody, because that's how we end up with so much sort of warped over nonsense. And I made the decision because it sort of stuck out to me, right? I'm sitting there I made the decision in the outline, right? Like I planned this particular one. Sometimes something will come up in the stories where it wasn't in the outline, and it's either better or I missed something, and it's like the inspiration is to fix a problem that manifested in the writing phase. Because for all of my love of outlines, I have never followed one perfectly, right? I'll get to the middle of
me neither.
Ooh, like something has to change, right? I rewrote the back half of Book 7's outline like 4 times as I was going, right, to try and make adjustments for ideas that I had or to solve problems. And often when I do get something that's sort of startling and weird and surprising, you get inspired by yourself as you're going, right? And that's what I think the Greek pagans would call the muse, right? That sort of mechanism, like, because where did that thought come from? It wasn't me, right? Except of course it was, right? Calliope, it turns out, is not real.
Yes.
And it was actually just a deeper structure in your brain. And you should totally listen to those, right? Because when you can get those mechanisms working, right, those are way deeper and stranger parts of your psychology than the part of you that sits down and very consciously plots something out, right? You get out of your neocortex, let the deeper systems function. And if they throw you an idea, man, if you get something from a dream, this is the David Lynch thing, right? I think I mentioned him already, right? I've been watching a lot of his interviews lately, right? He gets ideas from a dream, right? Or he'll sit there, and he was like a meditation guy, which, that's not me, but he talks about ideas as fish, and the really deep ones swim deep down, right? The really big ideas swim deep down. And to catch those, you have to be really still and sort of patient. And it's a good analogy, right? But I find that you don't always have to be still and patient. You can be working frenetically, right? You will have churned the waters up enough that one of them pops up. And you say, that's the one. I'm cutting off the main character's head. And you don't know how you're going to make that work. But once you've caught the idea, right, then that neocortex can come back in and rationalize the crazy thing that your sort of deep brain threw up onto the surface, right? And that's really been the process for me. Is I'll have these wacky notions as I'm writing along, and I'm like, well, people would normally not do that, right? And this is because I'm deeply contrarian, right? I, for example, when people say they don't like tropes, right? They don't like the chosen one. I don't believe them. I just don't think that's true, because Star Wars made so much money, right? You do like that, actually. What you don't like is bad stuff, right? And so you have to have a certain degree of faith in yourself that you can tell a story that people say they don't like in a way that will win them over, and just try it. Because if you have this overriding sense that this idea is worthwhile, you should believe that way more than you should believe any of the sort of talk around literature that's out there, right? Because people say all sorts of things. They don't like standalones. They don't like big series, right? Which is it? I don't know. And the answer is
yes.
It's not the same people, right? But somebody's gonna like it. Somebody's not gonna like it. And you should really listen to yourself.
Let's move on to your next lesson, which I believe is number 6 in our list here.
Yeah, so that would be to design to your strengths. I touched on this a little bit earlier, actually, but I'll be a little more specific and less sort of vague with this one. When you're setting up your world, right, you might have some personal expertises, but also some personal limitations, right? You might not know anything about how computers work. If you don't know anything about computers, you don't want to know anything about computers, do not write about them. Right? Find a way to write around them. Write a character who doesn't know how they work. Right?
Yes.
And so other characters can say, something as simple as, don't worry about it, I've got it. Right? And then you just don't have to touch that stuff at all. One of the examples I like to give is that I know nothing about contemporary naval warfare. Right, which sort of would rule out my ability to write a space battle convincingly, because we would imagine that would be extrapolated from how submarine engagements work. This is usually the analog, right? Is submarine warfare is the closest thing to space combat we think, right? Except it's a lot easier to see a spaceship than a submarine. That's so far outside my area of expertise. What I do know a reasonable amount about, however, is sword fighting. And so for me, I'm thinking about this. I'm like, man, what do I do? Frank Herbert, of course, suggests the shield. Okay, I'll borrow that. Perfectly fine thing to do. And so I'll take the shields, but also we still have naval engagements because this isn't Dune, actually, and we have spaceships that actually are doing things in the text. And then this idea suggested itself to me from Roman history. The Romans were terrible at naval engagements. But what they were really good at doing was beating people on the ground, right, with swords and shields and spears. And so they developed a device for latching their ships onto Punic ships, Carthaginian ships, so that they could then fight land engagements on the sea. And that's how they beat the Carthaginians. This was an absolute game changer for them. So what's the literary equivalent of this, right? Boarding actions, ramming, right? And so the few space engagements that are in the series, because it isn't the main focus, right, are inspired by the Punic Wars and by the Corvus, right, which is this mechanism for boarding ships in the Roman period, and so I could then write sword fights on spaceships and then justify those with some world building, right? But that was a means of building the world to play to my personal strengths as a person who knows things, but also as a writer, right? I think I'm much better at writing a sword fight than I am a naval engagement, just because I have more practice, right? And so you can do this with all sorts of things, right? Tolkien and languages, for example. He has this thing he loves, right? Happens to be a very wonderful thing if you're trying to build a fantasy world, it turns out. But you see this too with the other example that always jumps out to me is Patrick Roth is clearly a coin nerd, right? It doesn't take a lot of detail to get readers to really buy into a world, right? This is a thing I think people are often paralyzed by. They think they need to have answers to everything. It turns out that all you really need to do to make a character real is give them one thing, right? They need to have a tick or a fondness for something, or a distinctive physical trait, or an affectation in speech, and character readers will fall in love with that character. It takes very, very little. This is true of worlds too. If you have a thing, if that's language, if that's coinage, if that's cuisine, George Martin, right? People will they will see that thing and your love for that thing as a window into the rest of it. And if something is sketchier, if it's more vague, if it doesn't make sense, they will be more forgiving of it because they're already sort of in through this door you've built with this thing that you're good at, this thing that you like. And you can make those decisions very high level, right? Even before the outline, right? Just because you are attracted to them, right? Or you're aware that you aren't good at X, Y, or Z, right? For example, there are tons of stories I love spy thrillers, but I don't know enough about mid-century British espionage to write one. I'm just never going to write one. I love James Bond. I love the Le Carré books, but I'm never going to write one because it's just the amount of work I would need to do to become a writer who can do that is just work I don't have. Frankly, at this point, it sounds pretentious to say I don't have time for. But I'm kind of locked in as a science fantasy writer, at least for the moment, because I need to write the next book, and I need to move in that direction. And so I need to write stories that play to my strengths. And if I were to try and write something like that, what I would probably do is take the things I like about those and transpose them into a setting that I can work with, right? And so you find a way to, to use your toolkit, whatever your toolkit may be. Especially if you're trying to work at speed and quality simultaneously, then you need to balance those things.
Yeah, the way I think about it is it's about dropping immersion anchors, right? So I think a lot of new writers think that they need to fully develop every single aspect of their world, as you mentioned. But in my experience, it's really about just doing one or two immersion anchors. And an example of an immersion anchor is in, Empire of Silence, right? You get Hadrian onto a ship and you explain that there's this thing called a fugue. And when you go in the fugue, it drains the liquid from your body. It stores it separately. It injects in this particular substance. I believe it's called, is it N9 or something? N7? I'm not sure if I'm remembering the
I think. Yeah, which means
correctly.
Nothing, right?
TX9, yes.
Yeah.
So, somewhat technical sounding term, you kind of show this thing and what you're doing there is you're going in just a little bit more detail, right? Because another author might just go, oh, and then he went in the cryosleep pod and then he woke up, right? And that's fine. You can absolutely do that. But by just adding those few extra details about how this works, it kind of tricks the reader into imagining that you have scientifically, gone through all this research and study on how to actually preserve a human body. And that little immersion anchor you've given us there, which maybe only takes 100, 200, 300 words, it then means that when you briefly mention some other technology or some other aspect of the world, the fact that like, oh, it's going to take our spaceship this long to get from here to here, right? The reader goes, cool, I believe you, because you proved world building competence with this one thing before. And it means that when you just gloss over something else, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and imagine that you have also developed it to the same extent. So I think that's really empowering because, the world building in Sun Eater is amazing. I was actually going to talk about that as another one of my lessons, but I'll change it because we've talked around it a bit here. But yeah, you see this over and over again throughout the series. Like, you are focusing on the things that you're truly interested in. And there's a lot of things that Hadrian's like, yeah, I don't really know how that works, or I'm not paying attention to that, or I'm not going to, go into this in a lot of detail. And I think that's so important for writers to keep in mind because it can be paralyzing if you feel like you really need to develop, logically work out every single aspect of your story. In reality, you just need to go deep into a few different parts of your world building, and the reader will kind of fill in the rest of the gaps in their mind.
Yeah, and know too that you're going to lose some people for whatever your decisions are. There are people who are very frustrated with me for not explaining the propulsion technology and the spaceships in greater detail, right? It is just not narratively relevant, right? Like it just has never been important how that stuff works beyond the fact that, it's powered by antimatter and you really got to contain that stuff, right? Nothing else has been narratively relevant, right? But there are people who just love that stuff, right? And so there's a certain amount of audience sort of aiming that you need to do, right? You don't want to completely disappoint sort of the people who are going to end up being your core audience. So if you, this is where listening, is also sometimes helpful. If you find a question is brought up over and over and over and over again in reviews, then maybe you need to address it, or maybe it would be interesting to address it in some way. And especially too, if you can then address it in a way that like gives them an answer different from what they were expecting, or challenges them back in some way. I love this. As I said, I'm contrarian by nature. And so if I find a way to like then prod my readers in the eye for asking this question over and over again, by making the book harder or more painful in some way, right, for the characters, that can be very fun. But you can also reward the reader as well, right? Reward their faith, reward their curiosity with an answer. And there is it's not quite something parasocial about that, but it is. It looks like you planned that answer all along, but sometimes you pick these things up along the way, and you're like, man, I didn't ever think about the propulsion system is important. But if you really want to know, right, like, could I make that relevant in some way? Could I do something with that would then reward they're constantly worrying about this question? It suddenly comes up, right? It's not the propulsion system, but there is a question that will be very clearly, I think, answered in book 7 that will get people to be like, oh, he was listening, right? Or he already, this was in his head the whole time.
I don't think this is what actually happened, but I remember reading a review of Aragon, right, by Christopher Paolini.
Yeah.
And it was quite a negative review, right? The person was saying, oh, well, of course, I know exactly what's going to happen later in the series. He's going to, he's going to end up with Arya the elf. He's going to do this thing. He's going to do that thing. It was kind of like these are the cliched things you would expect to happen from this kind of story. And it was almost like Paolini read this review and completely just went against it in the last book, because I actually think that, while the first Aragon book is often derided for being a little bit derivative or whatever,
sure,
where he ends up the series, it's actually a little bit different from where the setup is. Like, Aragon doesn't get the girl. Like, he kind of leaves the country in a little bit of disgrace at the end of it. And there's just like these interesting things where, part of me almost wonders whether that was the same thought process he went through, where he maybe read these early reviews and he thought, you know what, that would actually be kind of fun if I went against it. So to your earlier point, I think that spite and contrarianism is a fantastic tool to have as an author.
Yeah, as long as you can make it work, right? You can't just burn the whole thing down because you're mad. And I can't think of a series. I've seen that happen before, but I can't think of what it was. But yeah, no, there is a. It's not that you have necessarily a relationship with the audience directly, right? But there is, although you do also, right? But there is this sort of weird push-pull thing that you get there, which is less a relationship because it's not so much about a person. It's if you see a thing emerge from a lot of people frequently enough, like it's almost like that idea exists in a like a more substantive way, then it's like just one person. Like I need to respond to this idea, right? Like most criticism, like one to one, each individual review is, I think, worthless is a strong word, right? But my wife's a data scientist, right? And she looked through the stuff. She said to me once, she was like, there are only 10 reviews of this book, right? Right. Like if we factor analyze everything anybody ever says, these are the reviews that you get. Right. And so when I see a review, I'm like, oh, this is the one that, says the Dune thing. Right. This is the one that, especially negative reviews, this is the one that says that. Right. And then you can get these sort of ideas of what you're doing that's bothering people. Right. And enough people, if you see it frequently enough. Right. Because obviously you get an outlier who just is like, a crazy person howling at the moon. Right. But then you have like a thing that maybe is a weakness that you weren't aware of. Right. That you can respond to, but you can't respond to single people. Right. One, because that's rude. Right. You as the author should never respond to a single review unless it's like personally aggressive in some way. Then you can. But even then, maybe you shouldn't. If someone called me a liar, I'd be like, well, hold on, buddy, right? But if they said my book is bad, whatever. But if you see like 30 people say the same thing or 100 people say the same thing, maybe there's something there that you're not doing well enough. And like you could listen to that and you could make an adjustment, but it just might not be the adjustment they're expecting. And maybe that's better if it's not, right?
I think it always comes down to like, as a storyteller, you've got your promise, you've got your progress, and you've got your payoff, right? And a good author knows when to pay off the promise in an expected way, but they also know when to subvert it a little bit, or they know how to deliver, A and B of the promise, but they take C and they twist it and do something else with it instead. And that's where I think outlining is useful, right? Because you are able to kind of get that higher level overview of your story, and you're able to ask yourself, okay, what's the expected way of telling this book? It's this method. Okay, what if I did, the most unexpected way of telling it? Oh, it's this method. Well, maybe that's a little bit too far out. Perhaps there's a middle ground here where, I am doing some things that are expected, but I'm also subverting expectations in another way. So yeah, again, that's why I think that's a useful tool. Next thing I'd like to talk about in terms of the next lesson I took from this is how to write a soft magic system effectively. And I think that what you have done with Hadrian's abilities around magic is incredibly risky. Again, it comes back to that idea of like risky decisions, but they're executed really well. And what I mean by that is that Hadrian has almost this godlike ability to, and this is getting into spoilers for later books, I suppose, from Howling Dark onwards. Hadrian has this almost godlike ability to see versions of the future and in the present to sometimes like shift the reality he's in. So a good example of this is to prove this power to someone, he like gets a gun, holds it up to his head, shoots it, and he simply chooses a version of reality where the bullet just went through his head without actually killing him. And, it blasts a hole in the wall behind him, and everyone is like, what the heck? This guy is like a messiah now. What's going on here? And I think that what I find really interesting about when you introduce a magic system like this is how do you still maintain a sense of tension and stakes and not just feeling like, oh, well, the main character can just solve anything with, a click of his fingers. And I think that the way that you've kind of managed this has been done really well. Like you set up some interesting limitations around this, but more importantly, I think you also have a good understanding of when to deny this ability to Hadrian or when to kind of delay him using the ability so that then when there are these big dramatic moments, in the climax of Howling Dark, for instance, there's some other sequences too where it's like, he hasn't been able to use it, and then he uses it, and it's one of the most epic, stand up and cheer moments that you read in the entire series. So I'd be curious, just to get your thoughts on, sort of how you went about that and how you maintain a sense of stakes and believability when blending it with this kind of interesting magic system.
Yeah, so I almost feel like I should have this sort of meta answer first, which is to say that I don't like magic systems. I don't like the way we talk about it at all, right? Like I said, I think a lot of the language we use to talk about writing, especially fantasy and science fiction, but maybe literature more broadly, has been really ossifying, right? And so I was an editor for years, and invariably the fantasy pitches that I would hear started with the magic system, right? And it's like
interesting.
The idea is that the way that you tell a fantasy story is you come up with a novel form of physics, right? And then you set your story, which is an otherwise normal story, right, in a world where this novel form of physics exists. And if you watch Brandon Sanderson talk about how he thinks about this is exactly it, right? He talks about how he's fascinated with the Enlightenment and the sort of the transition of things like alchemy into chemistry and all this stuff. And the thing is that alchemy and chemistry are related, but are in fact quite distinct, right? Alchemy is not merely a science for trying to get chemical changes to happen, right? It is a sort of spiritual taxonomy of the world and the universe and the relationship of man's consciousness, right, to things above and things below. It's related to sort of the Hermetic tradition, right, which looks at a lot of that stuff too, right? It's not just chemistry, right? Chemistry actually is largely a rejection of alchemy, right? It's like we found the stuff that works. None of that other stuff works, right? Turns out the only thing you can do for syphilis, if you're Paracelsus, is poison it, right? It's not like none of the stuff with salamanders, right? Meaning the elementals, right? Works, right? It's different, and so many of the magical systems we have now in fantasy are fundamentally Newtonian, right? It's a question of literally energy in for energy out, right? And that can be very satisfying. I love the sequence, The Name of the Wind, with the burning village and the dragon, and using the scale and the magnet to pull the wheel down on the dragon and then put out all the fires in the village, right? Very cool, right? And it's very rewarding because all of that stuff makes sense and you get it, right? And you come away from that, you say, I would make a good wizard because I have a weird idea for how I would use this, right? And you forget that it's not real, right? And so you're rewarded with this sense of competency, right, in a science that doesn't exist. And I think that is kind of a waste of time, for the reader's time specifically, right? Now it's cool, right? It's fun, but like I was really struck in reading Lord of the Rings, which is my favorite book, which is a cliched thing for a writer to say, but whatever. It's that good. This last time, I was getting through the Old Forest, and Middle-earth is alive, right, in a way that most settings aren't, right? The forests want things, right? It's dangerous to go in the hills because they're the hills, right? The Barrow Downs are they're just a bad place, right? The magic is part of the character of the world itself, and it's not a system, right? There is no system, right? The Old Forest is dangerous because the trees are dangerous, right? It's their character to be dangerous. And that is a lot closer to fairy tale, right, than anything that modern fantasy is really doing. And I don't like the modern fantasy thing because it emerges really, I think, from gaming. I think this is an influence of gaming on literature, because people think about. You
can see the Dungeons and Dragons influence.
Yeah, because like all that's great, right? Like, but what D&D did was Gygax and company looked at a bunch of earlier stories. They cited them in Appendix N in first edition, right? And they came up with game mechanics by sort of distilling the tropes of extant fantasy and science fiction, right, to build the game, right? And then so many younger fantasy writers played the game, they engaged with these tropes, their most distilled sort of, ethereal form, and then they built it back out, right? And so a lot of modern fantasy, you can tell, is descended more from the sort of abstract symbols of these things, the tropes, from the game, rather than from the folkloric systems that fed into the fiction in the first place. And that's like a really different texture, right? If you read a fantasy book and you could tell like who the rogue is, right? And it's like really obviously a rogue, right? Then like maybe that character is too simple, right? Maybe that's not a person, right? Maybe that's a character in a game. And I love games, but so for me, right, I'm more interested in like what does the power, let's say, mean in the story, right? How does it impact the experience of the characters? How does it relate to what you're trying to say as an author? And if those questions drive your decisions instead of how much power do I need to fly, right? Then the story can maybe mean something more deeply. So I haven't actually written a fantasy series yet, right? So like I recognize that maybe I'm talking out of school. But it seems to me that the way I would write magic, right, is on the level of meaning, right? I think that the magic needs to operate on the level of theme. It needs to operate on the level of mood. It needs to sort of engage with the logic of the story rather than be an emanation of the world itself, right? If it is supernatural, right, shouldn't it come from above the world of the story, right? And so, like an example of this in fairy tale, right? You could just say something like, "This is a friend, my friend Nicholas Kotar gives the example, like if you blow out this candle, the princess will die, right? Why? What's the connection between the candle and the princess, right? In terms of Newtonian physics, I have no idea, right? But you can intuit a connection between the extinguishing of a flame and the loss of life, right? And it's actually sufficient, right, to have that connection and only that connection, right? And to not explain how or why, right, but rather to explain things to the reader in terms of meaning, right, in terms of what the story is, right? For example, right, you talk about boiling tropes down in fantasy. What exactly is an elf, right? Is it just a human with pointy ears who lives forever? Probably not, right? It's certainly not in Tolkien, right? The elves have a function in Middle-earth that's sort of nebulous. We kind of get glimpses at it, but like they taught the trees to speak, right? They have a role in creation, right, in Arda, right, that is different from and totally distinct from the role of men, right? Because men are going to inherit the world ultimately, but the elves, in a sense, program it, right? Which is analogous in sort of a Christian sense to the function of some of the lower angels, right? And of course, Gandalf is one too, right? He's a little higher up. So they function differently. They mean something different. And so it's appropriate for them to leave, right? And the relationship then between men and elves in Tolkien is a lot stronger and clearer than in latter fantasy, where it's just like,
they're just an aesthetic thing.
It's an aesthetic thing, right? It's like Warcraft turns like some factions of elves into like weird fascists who just think they're better than everybody else, right? That's still a kind of human in a sense, right? It's not good enough. It's not weird enough. It's not fantastic. It's very grounded, actually, right? They think they're better because they live longer. That's not a bad choice necessarily. Like there's interesting stuff you can do with that in the same way that like The Witcher instead having humanity sneer at elves, right, for whatever reason is also interesting. But I think it's more interesting what Tolkien does with elves than any of these sort of aftermarket's unkind, right? Latter day spins on
aftermarket elves.
Yeah, that's the wrong phrase. Cut that. Roll it back. These latter day takes on elves specifically. I'm picking on elves because I think about them all the time. Because they're cool, actually, right? And it's the same with dragons, though. We can pick on dragons, but they've just become either wild animals or pets, and that's not good enough. Dragons are way scarier than wild animals or pets. Like there's a lot more there. They're a lot more important mythologically. So anyway, so in a certain sense, I don't think about like how do I put limitations on the system at all, right? Because I know what the powers are for, right? And I know what I'm trying to do with them, and sort of how they relate to those things above the story, right? Talking about we'll say the Quiet here and the Watchers and all this stuff, and about man's place in the universe of Sun Eater. And so if I keep my eye on that, right, then it's very easy for me to not overdo it, actually. I have never really worried about if I'm doing too much of it or too little, because I feel like I've always been pretty restrained with it anyway, because you should be, I think. It's the same principle with like monsters, right? Don't show them too much, right? Don't explain them, right? The hardest thing for me in the whole series was how much dialogue to give the Watchers, actually, right? And how to handle that, because just having them talk too much would ruin everything, because then they aren't supernatural, right? They don't feel supernatural, and that's hard in a text-based medium, right? Since all you have, it turns out, are words, but always err on the side of doing less, I think, with these things is maybe a rule of thumb one might adopt.
That kind of, what you just said reminds me of an Ursula K. Le Guin quote where she says that the artist deals with what cannot be said in words. The artist whose medium is fiction does this in words. So the novelist says in words what cannot be said in words. I think that's the great paradox of literature specifically and actually that's another thing I really appreciate about this series is your ability to, it just feels like what Hadrian experiences is so kind of, I can't even really describe it. It's kind of like this cosmic thing. It's this sort of, I suppose almost like Christ-like experience of suffering throughout his life and him obviously becoming this sort of messianic figure. But there's just so many things. And even though you are using words to build that kind of emotional experience in my mind, it's very hard for me to sit down and go like, oh yes, this is a story about, a guy learning that it's bad to have revenge, or it's good to have love or something. Like it's about all these kind of feelings without names.
Which is this is very hard, right? Because like you can even when it is about those nebulous things, you can always boil it down to a few explanations, like a few sentences about what the story is, right? And they're all stupid, right? It's always like revenge is bad, right? We know that, thank you, right? But like actually, you don't know that, right? Like you need to feel it right before you know it. And literature, the reason we tell stories, right? Is so that the characters can have experiences for us, right? So that we can really learn them, right? We read stories so that their suffering doesn't have to be ours, right? There's a winery in California. I think I've told this story before. It's called like Stag's Leap or something. It's in Napa County. You can buy it in like any grocery store in America, basically. It's not like very expensive. But there's a ravine there where deer will frequently try to jump, right? And they'll fall because it's too far, right? Or it's just barely, right? It's like right where they think they can make it and they can't. So deer will die all the time, right? The problem is that deer can't tell stories about all the deer that have died trying to make this jump. And the only mechanism they have for testing the jump is their bodies, right? And they die, right? And if, one deer could just say, hey, man, like I've seen 48 deer in the last month try this and they're all dead. Don't do it, right? It just would stop happening, right? And so really what stories are, what myths are, what fairy tales are, and the older the better, right? Are these sort of deep structural engagements with the pattern of reality that we experience as people, right? Because like, the mathematicians like to believe that they're at the bottom of everything, right? They're the most foundational science. But human consciousness is closer to human consciousness's relationship with reality than reality, right? And so the philosophers and storytellers actually can do an end run around the mathematicians because there's this buffer between your senses and reality, right? Mathematics is great, right? But you have to get there, right? You have to get to reality in the first place. And so stories are in that interstice, right? And so the storyteller, right, engages with the symbols of reality, right, and puts them in a package that not just lets you learn them, but feel them, right? And if you can really feel them, then you really learn them. That's like, that's the difference between doing an exercise once, right, and doing it correctly, right? If you can get if you can really, really feel the burn, right, in a story, then you really learn the lesson, right? And that's what mythology does, right? It ingrains these sort of these deep stories in your head for the rest of your life, right? And where science fiction and fantasy, I think, are so interesting is that at no point in human history have we consumed hundreds of parallel synthetic mythologies, right? And we have no idea what this does to people. Right. It's a very strange experiment that we're running. And maybe it's a good thing. Maybe people come away with a lot of really silly ideas about how reality works because maybe some of the books weren't very good. I don't know. But it is something I think about a lot. And in a certain sense, Hadrian's powers are related to this question, right? Because his powers are about that interstice between his perceptions and reality, right? So maybe I'll just say that and stop.
That's brilliant. No, I I love that. And I think it reminds me a little bit of, I was listening to a Two to Ramble podcast yesterday. I know you've been on their show. Okay. Shout out to Austin and Richard for actually setting this conversation up between me and Chris here. But they were doing a fantastic analysis of On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. And he talked about this exact same concept, which is that, I'm going to butcher the way that he described it or the way that they described it, but it was this idea that like stories are more complicated than evolution, right? Like kind of talking about the idea that the most complicated thing that, exists in the universe is not necessarily the process of evolution or physics, but it's actually stories and how that kind of, how you can have an idea, like the fact that we can create an idea, this thing that lives initially inside our own minds, but then you sit down and you tell a bunch of Greeks about this great war that happened in Troy, and 3,000 years later, people are still, making different movies and interpretations of the Iliad, and people are still reading Homer and still kind of drawing life lessons from that.
And more than that, right? It animates like whole cultures, right? It manifestly impacts the world, right? I don't want to, we need to not sell it short, right? Like stories change people, right?
Yes.
In substantive, obvious ways, sometimes permanently, right? And that's, it's just really, really something, right? Sorry.
No, very well said. I do appreciate that because, it's like, I think sometimes it can be, I think that's actually something that's quite motivating to me whenever I tap into that as a writer, because it can be very easy to be in this sort of mechanistic, view of seeing the process of creating a book, right? And being like, well, I've got to have this particular structure for my scene, or, I'm taking my character through this arc or whatever. And that's important. And I think that's definitely valid. But I think it's always worthwhile remembering the kind of tradition that you exist in as an author, right? Like this sense that, maybe I'm not going to write something that's going to live for 3,000 years like some of Homer's work, but you are in a sense contributing to this conversation that has gone on long before you've existed and will continue long after you've gone. And the fact that we live in a time where these stories are so accessible to us, I think is amazing for me personally, because, if we lived like 300 years ago, right? Like think about how much more limited our understanding of past stories would be. Maybe we never would have, read some of these great classics or whatever it is. Yeah, so I think that's worthwhile just kind of reminding yourself of whenever you feel a little bit dejected as a writer, or whenever you feel like, is this worth it? Whatever. It's always nice to kind of remind yourself of, I suppose, these grander callings that you have as a storyteller.
Yeah, 100%. This won't work for everybody, right? But I'm a Catholic, right? And I take a great measure of comfort from the fact that the mechanism of creation, right, is language, right? And so there is, and this is Tolkien talks about the idea of the writer as sub-creator, right? Now we can't make something from nothing, right? Because we're humans and we're taking pieces from the world and history and science and other stories and things and sort of rearranging the pattern in some way, right? But there is something of the divine, I think, in that, at least from my perspective, right? I'm not trying to convince anyone that this is true, but there is at minimum something uniquely human about storytelling, right? Even the animals that do communicate linguistically in some way, right, or can use tools, don't tell stories as far as we know. And the use of language for storytelling seems to me to be really the point of departure between our species and the other ones. And it's interesting, at the very least, that that the Jews and the Christians have identified this as the mechanism of the divine, right? Now, there are other traditions maybe that have touched on this as well, but this is like the central thing, right? In Genesis, right? At the beginning, right, is this, right? And I, as a writer, maybe that's me just, puffing myself up, right? But I do think that's very interesting. It makes the job feel very important, right? At times, right? Because there are also times where it's like, man, all I do is write about space Romans and the vampire aliens they fight, right? Is it really that important?
Yes.
Like, should we be taking it that seriously? And the answer actually is like, yes. Because this is the other thing, right? Is that with Sun Eater, I can't remember where in the conversation I wanted to say this, but I wanted to say this earlier, right? Is that like actually everything, this is Hadrian, right? In his indecisiveness, right? He's so indecisive because he's aware of the consequences of his actions, because actually everything is crucially important all the time, right? Nihilism is the opposite of correct, right? Everything you do matters, right? In ways that you will never like fully understand all the time, right? And it's a miracle that we're not all frozen, right? With this awareness, right? You take the wrong turn in traffic, you kill somebody, right? That's actually like not trivial at all, right? It's certainly not trivial to people who experience it, right? You can say, the universe doesn't care. Like, okay, I don't care about the universe either, right? Really, like, like where the rocks are on Mars is not that important to me, right? Mars is cool and all, but it's like way more important that I just killed a person in traffic, right? Have some perspective. But this sort of all ties back to that, right? Everything actually is maximally meaningful, and that is sort of one of the things I think the books are about.
Let's move on to, I believe you have 2 more lessons to share from memory. So if you go to the next one, and then I'll do my last one, and we'll go back to your last.
Yeah, cool. This one's pretty short, actually, for a change, I think. And that is, you should borrow expertise if you need it, right? So we're talking about all these like weak points you might have. Maybe you don't know about naval battles, right? Maybe you can find someone who does, right? If you a Navy veteran, right? In this case, right? You have someone you could talk to. I do know a guy who was on a nuclear submarine, right? So like, what was that like? How do you,
cool.
What do bearings look like? How do you say that out loud, right? Just so it doesn't sound stupid when I write it in my book. You might not be able to like find the right person all the time. But like maybe you can find someone who can translate some dialogue in your book into Japanese, right? Because you need a character to speak it for a few lines, and you want to put it in there because it would be cool, right? Maybe you can find that person. Maybe you can get someone who knows something about 12th century castles and like why they're different from 10th century castles, depending on what you're writing, right? You can go talk to people, right? You can do research, and you don't have to do it all yourself, right? You are the author, right? And that has a sense of singularity to it, but you don't have to do the job alone. You hopefully will have an editor at some point, but like it's also totally cool to like go and ask for help. I've been doing that increasingly, and it is very relaxing, I've found.
Yes.
So don't be afraid.
And it comes back to that idea of an immersion anchor, which I talked about before, right? Is like talking to that naval expert or talking to that person who knows that specific detail. It means that you can then just slip that into your story. It's a few hundred words, but it makes you feel so much smarter to the reader, right? And then it means that the reader buys into your story in a much deeper way, and they begin to, they experience it on a much more profound level because of that extra detail that you have added in. So yeah, I totally think, and again, this is where we're so blessed today as writers, the fact that, there are all these amazing YouTube channels that people can look if they're like, well, I want to know how to make a sword. There's all these great YouTube channels where you can look up a blacksmith making a sword from scratch, and you can actually pick some interesting details from that, which you can then slip into your book.
It takes this much detail to do it. So it's very, very easy to sort of win that trust from your readers. And it's also relaxing for you, like I'm saying, right? Like it takes a lot of the anxiety you might feel about the quality of your own work away, because at least that's right, man. Maybe it's not good, but it's right. And that at least helps, take away some of the worry. And books are long. They take a long time to write. You're going to worry a lot. If you can reduce that by even 3%, man, you should do it. All
right. Well, my final lesson is, again, big spoilers here for Kingdoms of Death. How to create an amazing antagonist, because I think that Siriani Doriaika, I hope I've pronounced that correctly there, is just a fantastic creation. And I think that for most stories, like the quality of your protagonist is so dependent on the obstacles they're going to overcome. I think that you can have stories where they don't really face meaningful opposition. In those cases, more of the conflict is usually through the character's internal struggle and their internal difficulties they have to overcome. But I think that when you can create a protagonist who is, on the same level as an antagonist who is on the same level as your main character, it just adds so much weight to a story. And I think Siriani is a great creation. You have a lot of amazing antagonists in this story, with some of the extra Solarians, the agents of Minos and that sort of thing, and even to some extent, various figures throughout the Empire as well. But Siriani to me is, I think, where the series really kind of stepped up a notch when it came to the forces of opposition that Hadrian faces. I think he is brilliantly terrifying. There is a great sense of kind of scaling and contrast that you use to build him up, right? So like in the first book, we deal with one Seosin and they're kind of I guess they're in the Colosseum. Am I pronouncing that right? The Colosseum?
Yeah.
Colosseum, yes. I was trying to remember if you had like a different name for it.
The Colosso or the games themselves, yes.
That's what I was thinking of, yes. Yeah, so, you kind of introduce Seosin there and they're threatening, but they're not that bad. Then you kind of see towards the end of Empire of Silence. The Cielcin come down into the ruins, and they are pretty terrifying the way they're described. And then we get into, Howling Dark, and we see this like a big group of Cielcin in the battle towards the end, and they've got the kind of snake drone things, which are just an absolutely terrifying creation, and I think such a brilliant little piece of world building there. And then we kind of keep scaling up all the way, and you're like, wow, this group of Cielcin is bad. Oh my god, this is like the leader of, a tribe of Cielcin. This guy's even worse. Oh, it is even subservient to Siriani up here. And then what you do with Siriani as well to make him even more threatening as the series progresses. I just thought it was brilliant. So yeah, I'd be curious to know, what your kind of, your thought process was behind that, and how you thought about, building up this antagonist.
Yeah, well, the thing with Siriani in particular is I wanted it to be a bit more. The threat it poses, Hadrian, is philosophical, right? More than anything else, right? They deeply disagree.
Yes.
And so they can have a relationship because they disagree. It's not about like you're in my way, or you're a stupid human, right? It's you are wrong, actually, and I'm going to prove to you that you are wrong, right, about everything, right?
Yes.
About your relationship with the universe, your understanding of the world that you live in, right? And there are some factual things Hadrian is wrong about, right? But in a weird way, right, the one thing Hadrian is sure about is that Siriani is wrong, right? About meaning, basically, about being itself, right? And so they have this like very basal philosophical disagreement. Despite that, actually, like all those sort of secondary stuff they kind of have in common. They're both like kind of drama queens. They
both love Shakespeare,
Right. There's that little bit of a Siriani likes humanity in a way that Hadrian likes the Cielcin. He's very interested. They're both very interested in the other species. And it is only this intractable philosophical disagreement that keeps them from being friends, even, right? And some essential biological differences. And there's a tragedy in that, I think, right? But it's a deeply personal one, right? Because the thing is that people always say you want your villain to be the hero in their own story, right? And increasingly, I've come around to the notion that that's not putting it strongly enough, right? You should simply say the villain needs to be a hero, right? Now, Siriani to the Cielcin is the guy, right? And you can see why, even though the Cielcin are pretty horrible in a lot of ways, right? There's some virtue there, right? There is a distinct charisma, right? It's hard because the Cielcin are so awful, maybe, to illustrate this very clearly. I was playing this video game, Metaphor, ReFantazio recently, which is an RPG from Atlas. They did the Persona series. I have some quibbles with it, but the thing I really, really liked was that the villain was pretty likable. He was a pretty admirable character. He wanted this insane sort of Nietzschean vision for the world, but he wanted it because he'd been deeply hurt, right, in a lot of ways. It was understandable. But he was personally quite courageous. And so when you go to fight him, at one point in the game, he was like, this is a duel, right? This is one-on-one, but the whole party, you can all fight me, right? Attacking any number, right? However you want, hit me with your best shot, I can handle it, right? And it's this guy actually is very cool, right? Yes. And there's a distinct actual virtue there, right? And you need your villains, I think, to be objectively virtuous in some capacity. Whether that's just charisma, whether that's courage, whether they have an overriding sense of justice, even if that justice is bent in some way, they can even be kind, right? But the thing that makes them compelling, I think, is their virtues, and not their faults.
Yes.
Because the real problem you see, people say this all the time. They see this in readers, filmgoers, whatever. When they like the villain for the obviously wrong reason, they're like, this is dangerous. This movie shouldn't exist, right? Let's maybe put the Joker away for a while, DC, whatever, right? Sure. I think that's unfair to the art, right? Because you can't be responsible for what's in the public's heart, right? But when the villain is actually heroic in some way, right? Whether that's personal courage or whatever, right? They are actually dimensional in a way that is very difficult. And I think Sirianni has that. I think that's the sort of I think personally it's actually quite likable paragraph to paragraph. I think it's quite compelling.
I agree. Yeah.
And then but then it does something horrible, right? I think this is why people like Hannibal Lecter, right? Because he's actually kind of a sweetheart until he's not.
Yes.
You know,
but he has a moral
Hopkins
code,
version.
right? Like he only eats people who are kind of, rude to him, or when he makes, what's his face? There's the prisoner who like says something to Clarice, right? He kind of like says something a bit lewd to her.
Yeah.
And then he
it's
makes
like,
him kill
Hannibal.
himself,
Like
right?
that guy did deserve it. Right. You know, there's something, there's something really cool about that. And then you've also got like, the suits and the haute cuisine, right? That's all sort of attractive,
yes.
right? But the actual virtues, right? The thing that's so compelling about Satan to people, right, is the Lucifer story, right? Not only is he, a rebel, right, but he, and people like rebels, especially Americans. But like he was like the best angel, right? Yes. Like that's cool. You were the best angel. That's awesome. Like angels, and the sort of I have a bunch of Gustave Doré prints in my office, right? None of them from Paradise Lost, right? But like you've got this sort of the Miltonic Satan, right, in the Roman garb with the wings. Like he's very attractive, right? And he's attractive because of the savoir-faire and the courage of his convictions, even if they are like evil convictions, right? It's hard to see that they're evil, and that is. And that's the greatest villain of all time, right? It's So it's the virtues, I think, that really are important in building a
I think that's
villain.
It's really well said. And I'm writing a nonfiction book about how to plot your fantasy novel at the moment, and one of the chapters I just finished was about your antagonist. And something I was saying in there, which kind of perfectly pairs into what you've just mentioned, is this idea that the best antagonists are often competing for the same goal as your protagonist. It's not just a case of like, protagonist wants to get over here, antagonist wants to get over here, and they kind of meet in the middle because, there's not enough room in the corridor for them to pass by each other. The best antagonists, I find, they are engaged in a kind of philosophical struggle with the protagonist over the nature of reality, over how something should be, right? So a good example of this is like The Killing Joke by Alan Moore, right? Like Joker and Batman, they're locked in this struggle. Joker wants to prove that even a virtuous person is only one bad day away from becoming just like him, from becoming this creature of chaos and anarchy. And Batman has the opposite. He's like, no, I think people can be good. I think people can be good deep down. And so the conflict is not just, these guys punching each other. It's them locked in this kind of philosophical disagreement about how the world should be. And I think that's what you've just said about like Hadrian and Sirianni, right? They are locked in this sort of philosophical struggle over, is the universe like a good idea? Maybe that's putting it a bit too simply, right? But like Sirianni sees it as a perversion in a sense. He sees it as this is a creation of the quiet and should never have been, and my job is to try and transcend this. It's almost a little bit like the idea of reaching, I believe it's like nirvana in the Buddhist traditions, right? This idea that like, the goal of that practice is to escape the endless cycle of rebirth and to ascend to something that is higher from there. Whereas Hadrian, he's like, no, like this is worth fighting for. It's that nihilism versus, I suppose, optimism debate again.
Yeah. And you have to, right, there's a relationship between the meaning of the story, right, and the action in the story, right? And so Hadrian, like, really, really suffers for this belief, right? And the ideas, right, it's one thing to have these philosophical notions, right? But for it to be drama, right, and the advantage of drama is that you can act it out, right?
Yes.
And maybe this relates back to the powers question in a sense too, right? If you take those convictions seriously, then you like can't and shouldn't weasel out of it by using powers and things to cheat, right? Because the point actually is the suffering, right? Is the meaning of the story. It's not anything else, right? It's not some sort of wish fulfillment thing. There was a review I got, I think it was a YouTube review recently, someone was telling me, where someone was like, Hadrian is clearly a wish fulfillment character. I'm like, buddy, whoa. Opposite of right. Delete your channel. Not even close, right? Really
you don't want to be
any
tortured
of that to
for
happen.
7 years by an alien warlord?
Yeah, I'm all about that, let me tell you. But it is important to sort of illustrate that journey, right, in print, right? Because then you can feel it. People will be like, "Oh, this is too much, Christopher," right? Like, actually, like, no, it's not. Like, this is like the third time I'll bring up David Lynch, right? He's talking about how, like, we watch too many, murder mysteries. We have all these, like, often real tragedies packaged up for your entertainment and sort of disposed of by the end of the hour. And, like, that's messed up, right? That was the inspiration for Twin Peaks, is like, I'm going to make you sit with this murder for, years, right? TV executives had different ideas. Turned out Bob Iger, also a villain in the 90s, it's just still around, haunting us. But he wanted you to, like, look at it. And the movie especially got panned for being, like, so unflinching in his examination of this awfulness. And it's like, you've watched stories that are nominally more awful, right? We always are like, we'll say this when, like, we kill, like, a whole planet in science fiction, and it's, like, not a big deal, right? But then, like, one horrible thing happens to one character, and you're like, oh my gosh, this writer needs to calm down, right? It's like, actually, Alderaan getting blown up is way worse, right? It's just that, like, you can't, you just don't process it, right? And so that was important to me, is to make people look at this. And Sirianni is a vehicle for doing that, especially in book 4. But, like, the villains are often a vehicle for this, is for really making you sit with the ideas they embody, right? Because we all embody our ideas in some way, right? Even if our ideas are sort of incoherent and we haven't thought them through. But having the characters very clearly mean things, right? And mean to do things in the world was sort of, this applies to heroes as much as villains, right? And even to side characters. Right? The characters need to be about something, right? Both in the sense of action and in the sense of meaning. And if you can do both very clearly, great, right? If you can do one, that's fine. But you would ideally, everything would matter maximally, because everything should matter maximally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's get into the final lesson from you about the books.
Yeah, maybe so I made this one last because I'm still learning it, and it became very clear to me that I'm still learning it as I'm outlined as I was editing the end of book 7, and that is that you and I probably don't trust your readers enough. We're talking about how little it takes to convey something with world building, right? It takes so little, right, to get your point across in writing, actually, right? You probably have said something 37 times you needed to say twice, right? And you maybe even didn't need to say it at all, it turns out. And so I finished the draft. The first draft was 433,000 words. I got it down to 404. It went back up to 425, and then I got it all the way down to 370,000 words. And that was just the easy stuff. If I had years to really look at this, I could maybe get it down to 200,000, maybe, right? I don't know, right? But maybe. And a lot of what went was repetition, right? And a lot of stuff that went was saying things that were obvious, right? Even if it was just like a character behaved angrily, and then I said that he was angry, right? And it's enough to have a character's nostrils flare, right? You don't have to then say why, right? Learning to pare that back, either in the editorial phase or in the initial writing, is very important, I think, because I do think books are too long, my own included. And there was a comment that really stung me. I was talking about how long the book was getting in an interview, and someone commented, Christopher's last book is longer than the entirety of Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, and it doesn't have half as much to say. And I haven't even read it yet. And I was like, ouch, but probably true, right? Book of the New Sun is an all-time masterpiece. Right, I fully acknowledge that I'm not Gene Wolfe. I just want to be him when I grow up, right? And until then, I just my actual job is making people read his books because he's a genius. And so I thought about that a lot. And actually, the same person showed up in one of my live streams. I was retelling the story. He's like, "Oh, that was me. Sorry, I didn't mean to give you an existential crisis." And I was like, "No, you're completely right. Right? It's the most disheartening thing that happens to me." is when I read someone figure out something that I hadn't planned on revealing for like 5 more years, right? And I was like,
Yes.
I was not subtle enough. And I like really like want to be subtle, right? I think, you should want to be subtle. And so when like one person figures something out and then they tell everybody, I hate it when they tell everybody, it's the worst. Then you're like, man, I'm not actually as clever as I thought I was because I wasn't smarter than that guy, right? I was saying to my editor, and it was like, maybe if it takes them like a month to figure out this thing, then that'll be good enough, right? As long as it's not day one. If it's day one, I'm going to shoot myself, right? Not actually, nobody worry. But, it would be pretty demoralizing if they figured it out immediately, right? The thing I've always done, though, when that happens is do it anyway, because the reality is almost nobody has noticed, right? But it still sucks, right? But
Yes.
The important thing is to remember that readers are actually very smart, right? They're also very generous for the most part, right? There are exceptions. But you don't write for those people. You write for most readers, right? And most of my readers are wonderful. And I've really enjoyed, interacting with them. And the stories for them. And they might not figure it out. And if they do figure it out, actually, maybe that's great. Maybe they deserve to feel smart because they are, right? And that's fine. But also, maybe I should like try and make it a little harder for them and say less. And so, we talked a little bit about the next series, and I can't really say what it's about or anything. I've been asked not to. But like my primary goal is to write and say less because I've been reading a lot of Robert E. Howard, Conan stories mostly. Some of the other stuff. I like Cull a lot. And it is amazing how much that guy can do in 10,000 words. He can do more in 10,000 words than most modern writers can do in 100,000. Myself included. Yes. Right? And partly awesome. It's like we've changed the way we write action scenes, and they were a lot more abbreviated back in the day. And maybe some of that's good, and maybe sometimes it's good that changed. But also, like, there are lessons to learn from those older writers that we have abandoned, often out of mere chronological prejudice. I think it's a C.S. Lewis phrase, right? I would like to write shorter books, and I think that the challenge is in writing shorter books. It's very easy to keep going. It's very hard to know when to stop. And so I am going to try to limit myself to 150 to 200,000 words and see how much you can really get into that space, because it's a lot. Lord of the Rings is short, right? Tolkien says it's too short, and maybe that's true. I would have read 100 of them. But possibly that form factor is part of the secret to its success, right? The fact there isn't an infinity amount of Middle-earth makes Middle-earth more precious. And and not overstaying your welcome and being subtler and gentler, and therefore trusting your readers more, right? Because look at the volume of literature that's about Tolkien. Right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
If you can pull all of that out of books that are not very long, right? Maybe you don't need to write more. Just write better. And that's the challenge. So I really have an eye toward greater precision in terms of like density and exactness of prose next time, and that's sort of the mission I've set myself. And to have faith that my readers will stick it out and figure it out.
Fantastic. I think it's very appropriate that we wrap up a 2-hour conversation by talking about how being short is a good thing. But no, I certainly feel the same instinct myself. I think it is very easy to go along with stuff, and the real skill is knowing and how to. Sometimes the length is great, and it's personally like I am very excited to read book 7 and all 300 and was it 20,000 words of it?
70. Much worse.
370. Sorry, I shortchanged you by 50,000 words there. Personally, for me, like I love the length because I love the world and everything. But I also do know that, so much of the skill of an author is knowing when to hold back and knowing when to restrain yourself and cut. And I think to that Tolkien point as well, there was one of his letters he was writing to a fan where he talked about how part of the magic of Middle-earth is that sense of seeing off in the distance these, gleaming towers that you will never visit. And to go there is to destroy the magic. It's important to have these unexplored horizons so that you have this sense of the world being so much larger than what it is. And I think that so often with our focus these days in modern fantasy and modern sci-fi on extensive world building, on giving a lot of answers to readers, it's important to remind yourself that sometimes the best thing you can do is not explain how this thing resolves or not explain how this thing works and allow the reader to just process that in that mind. It goes back to all the David Lynch stuff you've been saying,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Where,
closure's a drug.
If you close off the question, then it doesn't have this open loop that's still running in the reader's mind and everything. So I'll be very curious to see how that kind of, how you manage with that in book 7, because obviously there's so many open loops in my mind at the moment from reading Disquiet Gods that I am very curious to know, like, okay, how much of this is actually getting resolved versus how much is going to maintain, this sort of mystery and this uncertainty in my mind.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear what you think about it. It's been a very long road, and it is, in a sense, over. It's not really over. It won't be over until the reviews come in. But I don't know what to do with myself this week at the very least. So I have to figure that out.
Just try to enjoy it.
I don't know who I am when I'm not working. So
yes. No, try to enjoy it. Yeah, I'm so excited for book 7, and perhaps we'll have to do another video talking about the whole series when it's all done. Yeah, I for one can't wait to read it. So congratulations again on finishing it the other day, and thanks again for coming on the channel and chatting about your process. I feel like I learned a lot from this, and I'm sure people will say in the comments below, what they've learned about it as well.
Yeah, gosh, Jed, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. I hope I didn't talk too much. I always seem to.
No, this was brilliant. Thanks, Chris.